let's restart and try and finish this as soon as possible. So carbon literacy training, everybody pay attention. Carbon literacy training is what we are going to be carrying on with now. So I have divided the entire training into 8 parts. Okay. We will do one part. So 8 parts is equal to 8 hours. Everybody pay attention, please. So 8 parts is equal to 8 hours. We'll do 4 of those hours in this lecture every week, 1 hour each. And we'll do 4 hours of those in the seminars, 1 hour every week. So by the end of last week, we started talking about carbon literacy. That was session 1. And then in this week, the seminar that you had was session 2. And then this is session 3. And then, of course, in week 4, next week, you'll have session 4. So whatever we discuss in the lecture will be the same topic in the seminars for the week after. Okay, so week 3, the topic is whatever today, and then the same topic for week 4 in your seminars. So in that way, we'll cover all 8 hours. Remember, your attendance is compulsory to be able to be eligible for the carbon literacy certificate. So I'll be looking at attendance towards the end, and I'll find out who's present or who's not. Your coursework 1 is not affected, by the way. Your marks have got nothing to do with it. Even though, of course, we would want you to be present for every single seminar and lecture, the marks of the module has got nothing to do with it. The carbon literacy certificate will definitely be something that you might miss out on if you do not, and that might be quite useful going forward. Right, okay, there are 2 topics that I want to cover today. Topic number 1 is what is carbon footprint, and topic number 2 is what does it mean by climate justice, and we'll try and gather some understanding of it. What does it mean? So the first question that we have is, what is carbon footprint? And we have used this word quite a lot over the last couple of weeks, but we really need to get to the basics of it. They are connected to emissions, and that's really an important thing to understand. So the first thing that we want to understand is what is carbon footprint. In fact, let me go to the definition first, and then we'll come to the video after. So carbon footprint is the amount of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere by a person, organization, product, or an activity. Now, this could be at any level. It says here it's at the level of a person as an individual, but it can also be at the level of a country. So we can calculate the total carbon footprint of Scotland. We can calculate the total carbon footprint of Canada, of the whole of the UK, of the whole of Europe, or the whole of the world. Okay, so it is basically a collection of all the greenhouse gases released. Now, greenhouse gases, as we discussed before, is not just one type of gases. Greenhouse gases is a family of gases, and that includes CO2, which is the most abundant one. You also have CH4, you also have nitrous oxide, you also have water vapor, and chlorofluorocarbons. Now, any activity, okay, what kind of activity are we talking about? It can be from the smallest of activities, which is sending an email to somebody, or sending a WhatsApp message, a Snapchat message, an Instagram post. You can calculate the carbon footprint of that activity, as well as any large activity, flying from Glasgow to London, or flying from Glasgow to Dubai, for example. You can calculate the carbon footprint, a nuclear reaction. You can calculate the carbon footprint of anything that you do. The banana that you ate in breakfast today, probably. The clothes that you're wearing, okay? The temperature of your heating, you will be able to find out what the carbon footprint of that activity is. So every activity that we do as an individual or as a collective, we'll be able to find out what the carbon footprint is. A larger carbon footprint means more emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, which contributes to the climate crisis. So if you think about from a country's perspective, you'll be able to see if the carbon footprint of that country is large, that means that that country is emitting a lot more carbon dioxide as compared to some other country whose carbon footprint might be quite small. I'm going to show you a video, which, hold on. So I'm going to be playing a video here for you, and that'll explain to you a little bit more what carbon footprint means in very simple language, actually. Great. Okay.
You know you should probably reduce it, but what exactly is your carbon footprint? A carbon footprint refers to the total amount of greenhouse gases released into the Earth's atmosphere as a result of the activities of an individual or an organisation. Remember, greenhouse gases trap heat inside the atmosphere, and that's overheating the planet. So if you want to work out your own carbon footprint, you need to know the amount of greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, you're responsible for creating. It's a difficult thing to measure precisely, and there are different definitions about how best to calculate it. But roughly speaking, there's the direct impact of using energy when we travel or to power our homes, and there's the indirect impact of the energy that's used to create all the things we use or consume. In the developed world in particular, transport is a big part of your carbon footprint. Cutting down on the use of petrol or diesel cars and taking fewer flights is one of the most effective ways of reducing it. The place you live also contributes to your personal footprint. It's important to make sure your home is heated or cooled efficiently and is well insulated. The more you can use sustainable energy like solar or wind power, the more you cut your emissions. The stuff you use at home also adds to the problem. All that plastic, metal and cardboard takes a lot of energy to produce and dispose of. So recycling can help reducing your carbon footprint, but not as much as how you travel or heat and cool your home. Then there's your diet. Above all, red meat makes your carbon footprint bigger because cows produce so much methane, another greenhouse gas. And huge numbers of trees are cut down to create pastures on which cattle can graze. In the developing world, polluting stoves are a real problem too, so it's important to try to replace them with more efficient methods of cooking. But overall, people in poorer countries produce far smaller amounts of greenhouse gases than people in richer countries do. So if you look at just what a country produces, the average amount of carbon dioxide emissions per person in the United States is about 16.1 tonnes per year. In China, it's 7.1 tonnes, and in the UK, it's about 5.5 tonnes. But in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's only 0.03 tonnes, while in Qatar, which has a really small population but produces so much oil and gas, it's 38.6 tonnes. Now, that's just production. It doesn't take account of all the other things we've talked about, how much you consume. But obviously, the more money you have, the more you tend to consume. So if people in richer countries really want to reduce their carbon footprint, they need to make huge changes in their lifestyles. It can be done, and new technologies to make things greener are coming on stream all the time. But it is a reminder that the declared aim in many countries of going carbon neutral by the middle of this century means a revolution in the way we live.
So it's the measure of all the emissions that are emitted by any activity that we do, which could be transportation, it could be eating, it could be buying things, etc., etc. Okay, so that's what your carbon footprint is, and we can calculate it. That's the main question, main answer there. We can calculate carbon footprint, and that's really quite an important one, right? So just to reiterate, carbon footprint is the amount of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere by a person, organization, product, or activity. And a larger carbon footprint means more emissions of CO2 and methane and other gases, which contributes to the climate crisis. So what's happening is that our overall emissions have been increasing, and that's leading to more global warming, and that's mainly the important thing. Now, I'm going to break this down into two smaller parts. Number one, carbon footprint can be one of the two. It can be production-based carbon footprint, or it could be consumption-based carbon footprint. Okay, and the difference is very subtle here, right? So what is important here to know is that I'll read that out first and I'll explain to you what that means. So we can add up all the emissions that are produced within that country, and they are production-based carbon footprint. And consumption-based carbon footprint is we could add up the emissions associated with the goods and services consumed within that country. Now, if you think about the UK, are we producing the same amount of goods that we used to produce in the 70s or 80s perhaps? No, not really. We've actually now cut down. Why have we done that? because most of the things that we buy are produced outside of the country. So think about production-based carbon footprint as something that is the total emissions created by activity done within a country. Okay, so total emissions produced by activity done within the country or the national boundaries. So whatever we produce now, even though we produce little, there is something that is associated with it. So in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., we had huge shipbuilding yards. We had huge railway building. We had huge steel industry. We had lots of cars production. UK had the highest, one of the biggest textile industries, and lots of other production that was happening. It was a manufacturing hub, okay? And that used to happen a lot. So everything that was connected to that was actually part of UK's production-based carbon footprint. But over a period of time, since the 1970s and 80s, what has happened is that the manufacturing has moved away. So where does our goods come from now? Where do the clothes come from? Where do the computers come from? Where do you think they're manufactured now? Anywhere? Mostly in China, perhaps also a little bit in other countries like Morocco and Bangladesh, our clothes mostly. The food that we eat is not produced so much in the UK, it's produced outside, in Morocco or in Spain or other places like that, right? So we are still consuming, but we're not producing anymore. So your production-based carbon footprint is all the emissions that actually are emitted as a result of whatever you manufacture within the country or whatever you do within the country. For example, if you're driving from London to Glasgow, then all that carbon footprint is your production-based carbon footprint. But if you consider the food that you eat, which is not produced in the UK, you're actually consuming it. You can't really say that, oh, we're not producing it, so therefore it should not be part of our consumption, our carbon footprint. So anything that you consume, even though it may have been produced elsewhere, is your consumption-based carbon footprint. So even though, let's say, for example, the laptop that you're using is manufactured in China, it will be your consumption-based carbon footprint. It is counted as your emission, not somebody else's emission. So that's the difference. Anything that is produced within the UK is the production-based carbon footprint. Anything that you consume, which is produced outside the UK, is your consumption-based carbon footprint. Okay, now tell me that since we've established that the UK is not producing as much as it used to produce now, but our consumption has increased quite significantly, which one of those do you think might be higher? Is our production-based carbon footprint higher, or is our consumption-based carbon footprint higher? Just a rough idea, rough estimation. What do you think? Production-based or consumption-based? Sorry? So which one do you think is high for the UK now? Is it consumption-based or production-based? Take a guess, it's okay. Consumption-based, because we're consuming a lot more than what we used to do before, but at the same time, we know that that consumption is manufactured somewhere. Before we can consume it, it has to be brought to us. For example, if you're eating lamb, the chances of it being produced in New Zealand is very high, because most of the lamb that actually comes to Scotland or in many parts of the UK is, some of it is locally produced, but a lot of it is actually coming from New Zealand or Australia. A lot of beef is produced locally within the UK itself. Most of the clothes that we buy are actually coming from a different country. Most of the Marks and Spencer, for example, almost 90% of the stuff that you buy from Marks and Spencer are actually manufactured in India. So many clothes that we buy from anywhere are mostly manufactured in Bangladesh. And so therefore, our consumption is getting higher and higher, but we can't really say that because that's not produced in the UK, it's not going to be part of my consumption carbon footprint. It has to be. Okay, so that's the key difference between what is a production-based carbon footprint and a consumption-based carbon footprint. But there is a problem with only using the production-based carbon footprint. Currently, under the Paris Agreement, and I'll pause here, Paris Agreement is question number 3 on your quiz. Now, not that bit here, but if you read the Paris Agreement, and I provided a link to you under the reading material on GC Learn, there is a link, a web link for Paris Agreement. Anybody knows what the Paris Agreement was? It's about temperature control of the globe. Any ideas? What did they decide in the Paris Agreement? Yes. Do you know what that certain amount is? The answer is correct. You can't go above a certain average rise in temperature by 2050 and also another by the end of the century. Do you know the figures? 1.5 and 2. Thank you very much. That's the correct answer. So basically, the Paris Agreement was actually made at one of the COPs, the Communication of Parties, in 2015. And like COP26 happened in Glasgow, COP 2015 or whatever COP it was called, I think COP 21 it was called, and that happened in Paris. And all the world leaders gathered and they decided that we need to do something. They realized at that point that the scientists were saying that the global average temperatures are rising quite a lot. And so therefore that is having a catastrophic effect on our environment and our society. And so therefore they decided that the global rise in temperature must be kept below 1.5 degrees by 2050. And we must do everything that we can do. We should put in all the efforts that we can to keep it under the 2 degrees average rise by the end of the century. Will you remember that? 1.5 by 2050, below 2 degrees by the end of the century. That's the right answer. That was what they agreed in the Paris Agreement. Okay, and there'll be 3 more wrong answers. 1.25, 1.7, something else. But you got to remember, it's 1.5 by 2050 and 2 degrees, below 2 degrees by end of century. So tell me what the 3 questions are. Question number 1. What is anthropogenic climate change? Question number 2. What is ESG? Stands for environment, governance, and social. Environment, social, and governance, rather. And question number 3. What was agreed at the Paris COP meeting? So 1.5 degrees by 2050 and no more than 2 degrees average rise in global temperatures by the end of the century. And that's what we're all doing. We're trying to do all that. That's really important that you keep in mind, right? Currently, under the Paris Agreement, carbon emissions targets are based on production-based accounting. And that is what many people think that that's unfair, because it means that the richer countries can reduce their carbon emissions without reducing carbon consumption by simply saying that we will stop producing it here in our country and we'll simply import it from somebody else. So if you're only calculating your production-based carbon footprint, you can claim that my carbon footprint or my emissions are lower because I'm not producing anymore. But that doesn't mean that your emissions are really lower, because you're still buying and consuming things from other countries and their carbon footprints are still captured. For example, although the UK has been deindustrializing within its own national borders, it has increased the amount of food it imports from overseas, leading to offshoring of emissions. So developing economies like China and India are often blamed in the media for global warming, but 20% of China's emissions are generated in the production of exports for our goods and services that we use. Is it then fair to attribute these emissions to China when they're being produced for the demand of other countries? So what the developed countries have simply done is they've shifted their carbon footprint or emission to another country. They've not really reduced it. In fact, it has increased quite significantly over the years because our consumption has increased. So that's a graph that shows the carbon footprint from 1990 up to now. And that shows that the red line is the consumption-based carbon footprint. So I think one of you mentioned that that was correct, that our consumption-based carbon footprint is higher than our production-based carbon footprint. So you can see that the red line is the consumption-based carbon footprint, and the blue line is the production-based carbon footprint. But the good news is that these are all going down. Okay, they used to be somewhere here at the start of 1990, but they're now going down quite significantly and quite steeply. But we want to bring it down to all the way to 0. When are we going to get there? If we follow the same trajectory, it's going to be here. And that might be, I'm hoping it's 2050 or before. The target is 2045. It's really important that we start thinking about that. If you compare that to China, which is where most of the production has gone up, you can see here that the top line here in China is that their production-based carbon footprint has been increasing since the 1990s, because that's when they started exporting to the world and manufacturing everything. And their consumption-based carbon footprint is lower. So you can see that the UK's is going down or UK's consumption-based carbon footprint is higher than the production-based carbon footprint. You can see that gap. But for China, the production-based carbon footprint has been going up and up and up. And that's been the difference between developing countries who are exporting to the world and developed countries who are consuming from the world. So it's really important that we start thinking about this. Okay, so what's the solution? One solution would be that in addition to production-based targets, countries also adopt consumption-based targets. And that is really an important thing. Countries must, when they're calculating their emissions, they not only think about production-based carbon footprint, but they also think about consumption-based carbon footprint. And that'll be a true measure and true representation of what their true emissions are. Otherwise, they will simply be hiding it behind somebody else. So I'm going to be moving on to the final topic of the day, which is climate justice. Can I ask you before that, are you all clear about what the difference between production-based and consumption-based carbon footprint is? All clear there? That's really good. Okay. So that's really important. We will not really go so much into the detail about production and carbon-based carbon footprint. In next week's seminars, we'll simply just do a classroom quiz. It's not a marked one or nothing like that. It's just a show of hands in the class about how much do we know. And we'll be showing you some countries' production-based carbon footprints, and we'll be asking you to organize them in a range. So that's what we're going to do in the classroom. The final topic for today then is climate justice. Now, what is climate justice is really important to understand. Let me just give you a little bit of a context behind this before we actually go on and read about the formal definition of what climate justice is. We know that climate change is impacting people all around the world. Okay, there's no doubt about it. People from the United States to UK, Europe, to Africa, to Asia, Far East Asia, Australia, everywhere, like Latin America, people are being affected by climate change. But the sad part is that it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. And that is where the problem lies. The system or the impact of climate change is unjust. It's not the same for everybody. So, for example, somebody who lives in the US and there'll be a storm, and somebody who lives in Bangladesh and there'll be a storm, who is affected more? People are affected in the same way. Of course, they lose their houses, and we know what happened in Florida last night. It's been a really, really bad situation where people have died. Whole cities and towns have been flooded, and the houses have been destroyed. And not just by this one, even the one that happened the week before, Storm Helene, that destroyed a lot of lives and properties and houses and everything. People had to be relocated, they had to be evacuated, they had to be displaced, and they might be paid compensation for the losses that they had. And that's a really grim situation. Now, think about somebody who lives in Bangladesh and there is a similar kind of storm that happens. Now, what is the response of the government? So there is no money to pay compensation, number one. There's no means to displace people or evacuate people in time, which means that more and more people are affected. If people's crops and land and houses are damaged, they don't get the compensation back. And so therefore, they are more vulnerable to the changes in climate as compared to somebody who is living in a developed country. The situation becomes even worse when people start questioning that, oh, wait a minute, my country or I haven't really contributed to climate change at all. So why is it that I am being affected much more? So what I'm trying to say to you is that climate change impacts people around the world in a disproportionate manner. So people or countries who've contributed a lot more to climate change over the last decades are actually less vulnerable to climate change as compared to countries who've actually contributed almost nothing to climate change or the worsening situation, but they're affected more. Okay, and that is the key thing about it. Now, it's not just about countries. It could be, for example, you all, now compared to me and yourself, who do you think has contributed more to climate change? Simple answer, right? I have contributed more to climate change just because I've lived longer than you. But who's going to be impacted more by climate change? Exactly. Is that disproportionate? It's an unjust system. The impact on you for no fault of yours is a lot more than the impact on me, even though I've contributed to climate change a lot more. So when you look at the same kind of picture, when you think about countries, you will think that a lot of countries are right in saying that we haven't even contributed at all to climate change. Why are we affected more? So that's where climate justice is. So in terms of a definition, what that means is climate justice means finding solutions to the climate crisis that not only reduce emissions or protect the natural world, but that do so in a way which creates a fairer, more just, and more equal world in the process. So what we want is people to be more equally treated when it comes to the changes in climate. And that's really very important. I'm going to skip that one, but I'm going to play this one here. And let's see what that says.
Climate justice.
Hold on. Is there another one after this? No. Sorry.
Climate justice.
What do we want? Climate justice! Climate justice now.
Two words that we hear more and more.
That climate justice is linked to racial justice, social justice, and intergenerational justice too.
This is why we call not only for climate action, but climate justice.
Two words that could define the century.
There is no climate justice without racial justice. There is no climate justice without gender justice. There is no climate justice without queer justice.
But what exactly does climate change have to do with justice? Aren't we all in this together? To understand climate justice, we need to understand climate injustice. Who causes climate change and who's hurt by it? Let's first look at who's responsible for putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and heating the planet. Imagine this grain of rice is 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Each year, the average person in Nigeria adds less than 1 grain into the atmosphere. The average person in India, 2 grains. In China, 7 grains. In Germany, 10 grains. In the US, 17 grains. In 1 year, the average American pollutes 20 times more than the average Nigerian. But the problem with carbon is that it stays trapped in the atmosphere for centuries. So it's not just about how much we add each year. It's about how much has piled up over time. Since 1850, that adds up to about 1,500 gigatons. Okay, so we wanted to pull loads of these rice bags on the table to show you how big that really is, but after doing the math, we realized we need 3 million of them. Historical emissions matter today because countries are arguing about how soon they have to cut their net emissions down to zero. Big polluters like China, India, and Brazil look a lot less guilty when you consider they've only recently become part of the problem.
Their tendency is to quote the annual emissions, but that doesn't tell us anything about, why we are in the current mess.
This is Prakash Kashwan, a political scientist researching climate justice. He says rich countries haven't accepted how unjust climate change really is.
It's mind-boggling, the kind of inequalities that have brought us to the current climate crisis. They're unbelievable and they aren't talked about enough.
In 2020, researchers calculated how far each country is responsible for pushing CO2 levels beyond a safe threshold that we crossed in 1990. The study takes into account how many people live in a country, how much they emitted throughout history, and includes emissions that cross borders through traded goods. The research shows that rich countries have outspent their carbon budgets. By a lot. The global north has emitted 92% of the CO2 that pushed the planet beyond safe levels. Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America have emitted just 8%. Even a massive emitter like China is only just using up its carbon budget now. But if you live in a country that runs on fossil fuels, this doesn't mean climate change is your fault personally. But some of your choices do still make a difference. Because it's not just about where you live, but also how much you spend. The world's richest 1% emits twice as much as the poorest 50%, and those elites live all over the world. Unequal emissions are one big reason why climate activists are shouting about justice.
Everyone already is is affected by the climate crisis, just on a very different scale. But if we look at the people ruling Germany and sitting at these decision tables for the past decades, they have not faced their responsibility.
They are destroying our environment. I think they need to act now, not later.
But hold up. CO2 heats the planet by the same amount whether it comes from Germany or Kenya. The climate doesn't care about geography. Well, geography cares about the climate. The second part of climate injustice is that even though poorer countries have done the least to change the climate, they're the ones getting hurt the most. Take heat waves and drought. Heat waves are becoming most unbearable across Africa, where droughts are even more punishing for crops. Then there's storms. Warmer air means that hurricanes and typhoons carry more energy and unleash more rain and stronger winds across the tropics. And by 2050, sea levels will have risen so high that floods which used to hit once a century will strike many coastal cities every single year. You can check out one of our other videos to see how some cities are trying to keep themselves afloat. The inequalities of climate change come together hardest in a country like India. Even though its people have barely contributed to global warming, they're among the most vulnerable. India's coastal cities are facing unprecedented floods while its rivers dry up, leaving farmers struggling to grow staples like rice and wheat.
India is one of the most inequitable countries in the world, and what we can see is that even if you take a city like Mumbai, when floods happen in the city, it's the poor that are the most impacted.
This is Payal Parekh, a climate scientist who campaigns full-time for climate justice.
Having grown up in a country like India, I grew up with inequality all around me. And this is essentially what it comes down to. The world is very unequal, and it's playing out in terms of climate change as well.
But that inequality is found within rich countries too. Black and brown people in countries like the US or the UK are typically poorer than white people. And that means they have less money to spend on air conditioning to adapt to heat waves or flood insurance to rebuild after storms. So, how can we make it fairer? Well, polluting countries can first turn off the CO2 tap and start removing their pollution from the atmosphere. Then they could pay reparations for using up more than their fair share of emissions. Some countries and companies are already doing something similar by paying poor countries to not chop down forests and instead plant trees. But instead of using that saved carbon to atone for their climate debts, they're using it as an excuse to keep on emitting.
So climate reparations have to be part of that discussion, and climate debt in particular is where we think about who is.
So just to stop you there and explain to you what reparations mean really, is that countries who have emitted more and contributed more to climate change must pay compensation to countries who haven't. That's what reparations mean, and there's a campaign to support that.
We kind of divide up who is responsible for the kinds of ecological changes and climate changes we're seeing in societies, but also the kinds of climate-induced disasters that countries are facing.
This is Keston Perry, a political economist studying climate justice. He says reparations are needed to balance the scales, but that they won't be enough.
It is an interim measure. When I say that, I mean it has to be, we have to have a sort of much more longer-term conversation around the economic system that we have nurtured and cultivated globally that have resulted in these kinds of disasters. And what do we do to not only reform that system, but absolutely overhaul it?
Reparations might sound radical, but rich countries already agreed to pay poorer ones to adapt to climate change. Imagine each of these Ps is $1 billion US. Rich countries promised 100 of them each year in climate finance by 2020. But it's 2021 and they haven't coughed up. In 2018, they gave 80 billion, but most of it was loans, not grants. UK-based charity Oxfam found that the real aid was actually closer to 20 billion.
Yearly, we have not been meeting the kinds of targets that even global north countries have set themselves. That finance mechanism is not meant to actually solve the problem.
Another approach takes climate justice more literally, holding polluters to account in court. After deadly wildfires tore through Portugal in 2017, 6 young activists took 33 industrial countries to the European Court of Human Rights for failing to cut their emissions quickly. They argued that the countries are discriminating against young people who will have to live with the consequences of climate change. The verdict is still pending. In Germany and the Netherlands, High Court judges have ordered their governments to up their ambitions on cutting emissions. Activists also won a case against Royal Dutch Shell, forcing the company to pay for oil pollution, and are now demanding climate-friendly investments too.
So the basic legal argument for assigning responsibility is your contribution to the problem. So how much do you emit? How much do you contribute to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions? And what is the possibility for contributing to the solution?
The defendants argue that national courts don't have the right to rule on the climate because emissions and their impacts are global. But a new generation of activists are fighting for them to take exactly that responsibility and give them climate justice. People have no idea how unjust the climate crisis is, and that's why we're making videos about it every Friday to help you understand. So if you like what you saw, then hit subscribe.
So, as the video suggests, the impacts of climate change is disproportionate on young people than old people, males or females, people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities, and people living in certain countries and not living in other countries or different communities. All that is very unjust rather at the moment. But science continues to show that as the impacts of climate change accelerate, extreme weather events are taking a major toll in developing countries, particularly in Africa and Asia, home to some of the world's largest youth populations. Global warming of 2 degrees, which is predicted by the end of the century, would put over half of Africa's population at risk of undernourishment. And as of today, we already have reached about 1 degree. In fact, it is 1.1 degrees. We've already reached 1.1 degrees, and we're trying to hold it under 1.5 degrees by the end of half the century. That's 2050. Global warming is likely to reach, all the predictions are suggesting that by 2050, we will be at 1.5 degrees. And if it continues to increase at the current rate, we will be there not too far away. So I'm going to be finishing this now because, of course, I know that you want to finish as well. But the key message that I'm trying to give you is that climate justice simply just means that climate change, the impact of it is disproportionate on different communities around the world. And that's the key message that we really need to understand. What we'll do in the seminars in week number 4 is try and look at scenarios. If we do not do anything at all, what will be the impact? And if you actually start taking positive action, what will be the impact of that? So thank you very much, everybody, for being here till the end. And have a good weekend. And I will see you next week on Friday.